Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
I was planning on going up to Oxford to see him, and that was 1963. He died, and I didn't hear about it because he died the same day that Jack Kennedy died. But when I got to England, the people we were staying with drove us up to Oxford on that day as my birthday gift. And Warnie let us into the Kilns, let me into the Kilns, and let me pick flowers in the back garden, which I, of course, pressed inside my Narnia stories until they were raggedy. Just got little crumbs of them left.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. We are delighted today to have Kathy Keller with us because she is one of those people who, as a child, wrote C.S. Lewis and got letters in return. We are so excited to have a conversation with you, Kathy. Thank you for joining us.
I'm very honored to be asked. Thanks for asking me.
I think an interesting study would be to track down all the children that Lewis wrote to and find out what they're doing now. He wrote a charming letter to a mother who said that my son Lawrence says that he loves Aslan more than he loves Jesus. What should I do about that? And Lewis wrote this beautiful letter about, well, in loving Aslan, you're loving Jesus without knowing it. And at the end, he says, please pray for me that I won't write anything in my books that will harm the faith of little boys or something of that sort.
Oh.
But I believe Lawrence is now a software engineer. You mentioned in one of your interviews that you were raised in a nominally Christian home with one Bible in the house that was given to you by a Unitarian aunt.
That's absolutely true.
And I wonder, where did your interest in Lewis come from if it wasn't being generated in the household by your parents and your family?
I had occasion to tell this story to my ladies' Bible study last week, or the week before last. We lived in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, which was a bedroom community outside of Pittsburgh, and it was unincorporated. It was raw. They were building homes all over the place. There wasn't a local library, but once a week, someone drove a bookmobile to the parking lot of the local Miracle Mile, it was called. It was one of the first shopping centers, and parked it, and you could come and return books, get new books out, and the driver was able to turn around and be the librarian. And I gravitated to all the tales of adventure and heroism. I'd read everything at a very inappropriately young age, the Odyssey and the Iliad, and all the Howard Pyle versions of Robin Hood. And one day I do remember very clearly going up to the librarian, and she's gone to her grave without any idea at all of how she has affected me and through me, Tim, and other people, and said, I read a good book once. I don't remember the title, but it had a lion in it and a witch in it. And she said, oh, I think I know which one that is. I'll get it for you. So the next week there it was, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I took it home, and my mother said, well, remember that author's name, because maybe he'll write more books and you'll want to read them. So that became my search to find C.S. Lewis books. And actually, that was the impetus to writing him. I, mistakenly, as it turned out, thought that he was some unknown starving writer over in the UK that nobody knew about, because it was so hard to find his books over on this side of the Atlantic. I'd look in every card catalog of any library I entered. There was always some idiot named Sinclair Lewis. No bookstore had him, nothing. And so it became sort of my mission to find anything by C.S. Lewis, which is how I stumbled across Mere Christianity at, again, a very inappropriately young age. And all the other things that he wrote, I would come across them serendipitously and read them, and then have to reread them like every 5 years after that, because I was way too young to get it. I'm still figuring out what that hideous strength is all about.
Did you become a Christian by reading C.S. Lewis?
I think he provided the soil of that. I don't actually know when I became a Christian. I know when God claimed my life that Lewis was the medium for that. But he doesn't really spell out things very well. He wanted to be into mere Christianity. So it wasn't really until I was in seminary that I heard anything about me being a sinner who needed to be saved. And there needed to be a sacrifice who died in my place and substituted himself for me. And I mean, I never heard that in church. I never read any Christian books but C.S. Lewis. I went all the way through college on just Lewis, which is a whole nother story.
But how did you end up at seminary if you didn't understand the redemption message?
Good question. I knew God had claimed my life. I said that earlier. I will tell you about that, even though it's very embarrassing. Well, no, it's not embarrassing. It's God uses what he has to hand. And I was the oldest of 5 in a very chaotic family. I would shut myself up in my room with my books and try to make the world go away. And the only real emotional connection I had was to my beagle, Pepper. That sounds silly, but, as a child, it was the only unconditional love that was available in our household. Let's put it that way. My family was, as I say, chaotic. Pepper got sick. She had a degenerative disease of her spine, and her discs were falling out of the spine and severing her nerves, and she was becoming increasingly paralyzed from the hindquarters forward. And my dad had announced that he was going to take her to his father's house and out to the back 40 and shoot her and bury her there because Pepper was a hunting dog as well as a family pet, and you just didn't let a pet or a dog suffer. That was one of your responsibilities as an owner. You didn't let them suffer. So every night I tried to pray. Nobody had taught me how to pray. The only prayer I knew was, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," and get to the part where I was done with that, and then just start crying and saying, "Jesus saved my dog. Jesus made my dog better." One night, as I was rushing through the Lord's Prayer, I felt like I just slammed into a brick wall. I got to "Thy will be done," and just felt like I ran into an obstacle. I didn't mean that. I did not mean "Thy will be done." I wanted my will to be done. I wanted my dog to get better. I don't care what your plans are, God. I want thy will to be done. And it seemed like I was like, I don't know, some Kafka-esque thing where there were big floodlights on me and I was pinned, underneath all of these lights saying, "Well, which is it? What's your life going to be based on? Thy will be done or my will be done?" And, of course, if you trust God, he's just waiting to get his hands on your life and make you miserable. You'll end up in a jungle with a pith helmet. You won't be married. There'll be bugs everywhere. That's all God really wants is for you to give your life to him, and then he'll make you miserable. But of course, if you say "my will be done," it's hard to fight God, but you could go down, fighting. I was probably 14 or 15 when all of this was going on. And at one point, I finally just dissolved in tears and said, "Okay, thy will be done," knowing I had signed my dog's death warrant as well as my own, actually. Only time in my life, here I'm married to a Presbyterian minister, I heard God say in my head, did not hear an audible voice, "It's not your dog's life I wanted, it's your life." So I got out of bed, I rushed down to the basement, I told the dog, "You're going to be all right, you're going to be fine." And God wasted a perfectly good miracle and healed that dog. I worked for the vet the next summer, and he gave me some sympathy about my dead dog. And said, "Oh, she's not dead, she went hunting this fall." He said, "Well, no, nerves don't regenerate, and, she had a degenerative disease." And he said, "I have the x-rays." And I said, "I have the dog." And I knew everything there was to know about apologetics through Lewis. I could talk circles around my professors at college, which surprised me. Every time they would say something, I would go, "Well, maybe." And then I would, channel some Lewis, and they would go, "Gee, I've never heard that." And I started to think, these guys don't really know that much. No, I don't know anything. And, I'm just telling you what I read in C.S. Lewis. But truly, I never had actually heard anything about salvation until I got to seminary.
Yeah.
When you first read Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, did you get the Christian implications of Aslan's sacrifice?
I did know that was Aslan and that was Jesus and he was dying, but I couldn't quite make myself believe it because Aslan was so attractive and Jesus was so boring.
You sound like Dorothy Sayers. She had the exact same response, and she grew up with a father who was an Anglican clergyman, but she just felt that Jesus, the way she had been taught it was filled with tedium, and she wasn't interested in tedium. So how old were you when you wrote C.S. Lewis? Was that before your dog's healing?
It was my dog's healing. Doesn't that sound terrible? I was 12 or 13 and sort of condoling with him, letting him know he had a fan somewhere in the world because he obviously was an unknown guy struggling to write children's books.
How did you know where to write him?
I knew he was at Magdalen College, Oxford, so I just addressed it C.S. Lewis, Magdalen College, Oxford, England, and they got to him. With his letters that came back to me, I taped in the back of the Narnia books with Scotch tape, and so when I finally got smart enough to realize that the tape was disintegrating into the letters, I took them out and framed them, but I think I might have lost one. I mean, I have 4. They're on the wall right over there to my left. But I think there might have been a 5th one somewhere. But they're very interesting in the sense that the first one was just a dear reader, thanks for saying you like my book.
Right.
The second one, I had said something to him about, oops, I shouldn't have said I got that. That's bad grammar. My English teacher doesn't like it. And he wrote this completely impenetrable response, at least it was to the 12-year-old, 13-year-old self, about how he wasn't an English teacher like my English teacher was an English teacher, that she was like a gardener trying to tell the difference between weeds and flowers, but he was a botanist and interested in both as vegetable organisms. And I kind of read it and went,
that's right.
Okay.
What I find interesting about that particular letter is C.S. Lewis was practicing what he preaches insofar as in other letters to children, he talks about the importance of show, don't tell, don't use abstractions. And basically, Lewis was summarizing for you a controversy that is still alive and well, which is between descriptivists and prescriptivists. Do you prescribe what is proper grammar, or do you describe the way people are using language at the time? And I think the reason C.S. Lewis has been able to minister to so many people, including you, is his ability to be a descriptivist insofar as he uses the language of the common person at a particular moment in time to communicate profound truths.
Well, all of that was lost on me as a 12-year-old, I have to tell you.
Yes.
Yeah, I can imagine. What did you get out of Mere Christianity when you read it at that age?
Oh, mercy, very little. I mean, it was fascinating. It was well written, and it was way over my head. I was not a dim bulb as far as I probably found that. I found it on a remaindered table in Horn's department store, and my eye was tuned to ever see the combination of letters CSLEWIS. So I got my eye and I said, don't know what it's about, buying it. It was like maybe $1 or something like that. And I stayed up all night and read it cover to cover. And, for years afterwards, every time I'd read it, I would say, gosh, I didn't know that was in there. But it was, I think, the sensation of just having somebody who was so intelligent.
Right. And also his wonderful metaphors. Even in the letter to you, he came up with such an interesting metaphor, the gardener versus the botanist. You see that all through Mere Christianity. There's a book called Mere Christians about people who became Christians through reading Lewis. But it's interesting how many different portals there are. For some people, it's the Narnia Chronicles. For me, it was the Ransom trilogy.
Oh, I love it.
But I did the same thing you did after I read the Ransom trilogy. I didn't read Narnia as a child. I asked my mother later why she didn't give us the Narnia Chronicles to read. And she said, well, Lewis was an Anglican and he drank and smoked. So I just wasn't sure how spiritually grounded he was.
So tell them what the name of the book was your mother gave you.
Yeah, my childhood reading was Pete and Penny Play and Pray. it didn't turn out to be a classic.
Baptized your imagination, I can tell.
As I listen to you, it sounds like you went through various stages of your conversion experience, much the way Lewis did, insofar as his imagination was baptized when he read George MacDonald as an adolescent. Your imagination was baptized when you read Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe at age 12. And then you had an interest in God, which led you to seminary. But it was only after then that you became a Christian who understood the profundity of actual Christian doctrine.
And I would even take that one step further. I became a raging, self-righteous moralist in between. I mean, God was my hobby. God was my thing. Nobody else amongst my friends had the slightest interest in God. And I felt so much wiser and superior and mature. Back in the days when dinosaurs roamed the earth and you still had freshman hazing week and had to wear the little beanies and carry around a sign or something like that, which I did in 1968 when I went to Allegheny College. I made a shield with a lion rampant that said "Do et Mondroit" on it, God and my rights. And if that wasn't an act of sort of defensiveness, I know I'm right and I'm righter than the rest of you. And I dare you to prove me wrong. So my entry into Christianity without any understanding of Jesus' sacrifice and his substitutionary atonement led me right into the Pharisees' pocket. I was low-hanging fruit. In fact, my freshman year roommate, and I don't remember what I did to earn this, but I believe I must have, wrote mean notes and left them around for me and called me a goody two-shoes, which I can't think of anything in particular I did to earn that, but it probably was true because I really did not take any pains to hide the fact that I thought I was on a superior moral plane to everyone else.
And how did you get past that stage?
Well, as I said, I went to Gordon Conwell and ran into some really wonderful teachers. Elizabeth Elliot was one of them, and Roger Nicole we had for systematics, and just really good teaching that pointed me to the Bible. I mean, even though I had become a Christian, I hadn't actually until late in my college career become convinced that the Bible was anything more than a bunch of pleasant words that you used on emergent occasions, weddings, funerals, that sort of thing. You couldn't really base your life on it. There was a word that my family did have for those people who believed the Bible a little bit too much. They were called crazy people. I wasn't a crazy person. I was a very well-educated, smart person. So it wasn't until I ran into the ministry of R.C. Sproul. There's a whole book out that Tim just bought. Put it over there. About the Pittsburgh revival and the way in the 70s everything came together with Reed Carpenter of Young Life and with Sam Shoemaker at the Pittsburgh Experiment and R.C. Sproul at the Ligonier Valley Study Center. And I was right in the middle of it, just soaking it all up. So finally hearing intelligent people who really trusted the Bible. But the kicker was the unanswerable argument to me was not, this manuscript and textual variants. I got into all of that in seminary. But the fact that Jesus believed the Bible, and if I trusted in him for my salvation, how could I say, well, I think you've made a mistake on, this every jot and tittle thing, Jesus. You must have just adopted the prejudices of your class, your time in history, etc. You can't accept Jesus as your Lord and then think that he's made a big mistake about the veracity of the scriptures. So that was the thing that really sort of brought me to a halt and made me feel like maybe I'm being too quick to dismiss this. So.
Was it in seminary where you met your husband, Tim?
Yes and no. He went to college, the same college my sister Susan did. They went to Bucknell College. Tim and I were the same age, and Sue was 2 years younger. And I had helped move her into her dorm room, and there was a Christian house where the Young Life leaders and the IB leaders all gathered. I gathered some very wealthy student had purchased this house, and it's where they all congregated and held their meetings and their training and whatnot. And Sue took me over there, and there was this tall, gangly guy sitting there studying Greek. And Sue just introduced me to Tim to me, and it was like, yeah, whatever. And I saw him from time to time. He would come to Pittsburgh with a bunch of Bucknell students to hang out with Sue, but he was one of my sister's friends. But then we both showed up at Gordon Conwell at the same time. And when you've left your posse back behind, I mean, I was a leader of the Christians on Allegheny's campus. He was a leader at Bucknell. When we got to Gordon Conwell, we weren't leaders of anything, and we didn't know anyone except we vaguely had seen each other. So suddenly we became very close friends, and that friendship developed.
Let's get back to the Lewis letters. There's another one that I find very fascinating, and that is Lewis referring, and this is just a month before he died. Wow. He refers to something that you must have described as a maddening experience as an author. What is he talking about?
Well, do you remember the scene in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when he defrosts all of the stone animals? And there's a lion amongst them, and he loads up the lion, and at one point he says, "Us lions will do such and so," and the stone lion that has now been defrosted goes around saying, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that? He said us lions, me and him. He means me and him, not lions." It's an experience like that. I wrote to him because I was writing about all the trivia of my life. I had written a detective story for our junior high school newsletter, and all is revealed in the last paragraph, who done it. But the editor, who was a junior high school student like myself, was trying to make the copy fit. And in order to do that, just cut that last paragraph out rather than taking out a bit in the earlier parts so that the conclusion could actually remain. And so it made no sense whatsoever. And so I was complaining about editors and what a stupid thing and what a maddening experience. And it was him saying, yeah, us writers have these maddening experiences. There's nothing about it.
Yeah.
So he was pulling me into the fellowship of us writers. Yeah, him and me and CS, me and Jack.
Wow. Tell her that famous statement, or you've repeated it to me, about editors from C.S. Lewis.
I'm not sure what quote you're thinking of.
Lewis once referred to the habitual baseless arrogance of, no, this was reviewers.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it was reviewers.
not editors. Yeah. The habitual baseless arrogance of reviewers. So on the one end, you have to deal with editors who are often getting rid of stuff just to get words on a page. And on the other end, you're dealing with reviewers who, and I've had that experience too with my books. One reviewer will say, well, this book on postmodernism, she doesn't even mention Foucault. And if you went to the index there, you would see I do mention Foucault. And there is this baseless arrogance.
But that was Harvey Foucault, so that wasn't the person she was looking for.
Yeah, Tim gets this all the time. I can only lay claim to one book that I authored by myself, but my husband, Tim, writes so many things. And all over the internet, he is accused of being promoting Catholic mysticism or Marxism or something like that. And he wrote a whole book on prayer where he spends a whole chapter talking about the baselessness of a certain kind of mysticism. And he keeps saying, they don't even read the books. They just make the stuff up. Right. It turns into an urban legend is what it is. Is that one person tells another person tells a third person, and suddenly it's true, even if it's contradicted 1,000 times in the written corpus. And yes, that's very frustrating.
Right. Lewis said in another letter, I like American reviewers. They actually read the book before they write the review. So he gave some credit to Americans. I wanted to go back to That Hideous Strength. I just wrote an article for our academic journal at the Wade Center 7 about Jane Studdick. Now, I think that's based on a real person that Lewis knew. He had a student named Mary Shelley Nayland who wrote him a lot of letters. And my theory is that the reason Jane is such a convincing character is that he actually had a young woman in mind who was unhappy in marriage, who was searching for faith. But many female Lewis fans, their one stumbling block for Lewis is the idea of headship in marriage. And that comes up in That Hideous Strength, and it also comes up in his letters to Mary Nayland. He talks about the Anglican prayer book, and the service of marriage mentions first to have a channel for sexual desire, second to have children, and third to be companions. And Mary Nayland was upset that it was in that order. So he wrote her a letter that's very similar to some of the things that Ransom says to Jane Studdick in That Hideous Strength. Could you talk a little bit about, I would assume you're one of the women who's more comfortable with Lewis's views than many Christian women are.
I actually quoted that exact letter and that exact part of that letter in a talk I gave recently, because I'm often asked to speak on what is now called complementarianism, although I predate the origin of that term. Yes, I think the best example of Lewis's understanding of masculinity and femininity comes in the coronation scene in Perelandra, where the Oyarsa of Malacandra and Perelandra are trying to appear in shapes that would do honor to Tor and Tinadril, and they present themselves to Ransom with all kinds of various images which he finds alarming. And in the end, they settle on shapes that don't have any secondary sexual characteristics, but the Malacandran Oyarsa, the masculine one, is holding something like a sword or a staff, and the female has her hands wide open, or hands open wide. I forget which one. There's a whole website by a friend of mine, I guess I only know her through the internet, called With Hands Open, where she's exploring masculinity and femininity through the whole lens of that scene in Perelandra, and the receptivity of the woman, both biologically and psychologically, as one of the defining characteristics of being a woman. And Lewis, thank goodness for God's mercy, never lived to see the rejection of that role in today's women. They reject anything that would tie them down to being receptive to new life, for instance. Tim and I were in England last June, and there was a magazine in the supermarket rack that Tim just had to pick up and read after he saw the headline. It's a woman who said that, "I feel like I'm being raped by my fetus, and I had to get rid of it, because I did not want to have any part of this intrusion of somebody who was a parasite draining the life out of me." And wow. Good night. It's come to that, is it? Instead of looking at the privilege of nurturing new life, you look at it as violence against the life that you have designed for yourself. So yes, I'm much more comfortable with Lewis. The one book that I said that I lay claim to having written solo and not in conjunction with Tim is called Jesus, Justice, and Gender Roles. And it's not a book, it's a booklet. Right. But I quote Lewis pretty freely in that book as well.
A nice alliteration, by the way, when I read that title, Jesus, Justice, and Gender Roles.
Yeah,
that title rolls nice. Right off your tongue. Good idea.
I got that title decades ago, and I was saving it for a big magnum opus I was going to write. And after a while, I realized I was never going to write a magnum opus. I was going to write a short book of what I knew, and I was going to use up the title on that. So it got a better title than a little booklet should have. But
So your own sons, have they read Lewis, and did they respond to Lewis the same way you did when you were a child?
That's a very good question. Our middle son is a pastor, and of course he reads a good deal of Lewis just in the course of his ministry and writing sermons. But as far as his imaginative works, I think I read them, the Narnia stories, and that might have been it. And I have a granddaughter who has really latched on to Harry Potter, but I keep saying, when you're done with Harry Potter, maybe you and I could read Narnia together. And she's in that awkward age, the preface to Lion. He writes to Lucy Barfield saying that you're probably too old for fairy tales now, but when you're much older and you can read them again, maybe you'll enjoy this. I think my 9-year-old granddaughter might be at the stage where she would feel like, well, I've outgrown fairy tales, so she's going to have to get a little bit older before she can go back to
Tell them there will be an examination when you get to the gates of heaven, and part of that will be on the Narnia Chronicles, so it wouldn't hurt them to prep. You mentioned in an earlier conversation.
They all want to inherit the letters, I'll tell you that much, but maybe I should make it again.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned in an earlier conversation that Tim can recite some Elvish from Tolkien. How about some of our other authors? We at the Wade collect Lewis and Tolkien and Owen Barfield and George MacDonald. How much of our other authors influenced you all in your worldview or your faith?
Well, I've read them all except Owen Barfield. I have not actually come across anything by him. Charles Williams, I've tried to read him every so often. Every 5-6 years, I pick up something and read it and go, yeah, it's still as weird as it was before. I don't get it. It's probably my fault, but I don't get it.
He is an acquired taste, definitely, Williams. So you're not alone in that.
And how about Tolkien?
Oh, my goodness. Well, there was a little bookstore finally in our town, and majored in really wonderful stuff. But I would go in there looking for Lewis stuff, and they never had anything new that I hadn't read. And the writer, or not the writer, the owner kept saying, well, if you like C.S. Lewis, you might like this Tolkien guy, this, Fellowship of the Ring. Well, it was the Valentine edition with the very weird cover with the strange birds and the bulbous tree.
Right.
One look at it and go, that's very weird. So finally he convinced me to buy Fellowship, and I started out with hobbits and their furry toes and closed it and just said, not going to happen. And I must have tried 10 times to read it, And in fact, this is true of, I must have some bad character streak in me. This is true of all my favorite books, is I initially loathed them. So I really people kept saying, you'll like it. So I said, I will read it through. And of course, by the time you get to the end of the first book, you neither sleep nor eat nor do anything else until you get to the end. So Tim and I read through the Red Book of Westmarch once a year at least, and he has read everything, the Silmarillion and everything that he ever wrote on a napkin, anything that Christopher Tolkien ever put out after his death. I have not read everything. I pretty much confine myself to the easier to understand things. But we have a big picture of a tree that is actually a representation of the angel oak outside of Charleston, South Carolina. But everyone who knows us, when they come in and look at it, they say, oh, is that leaf by Niggle?
Now, you mentioned that you wrote a detective story. Did you ever read the detective fiction of Dorothy Sayers?
Yes. Peter Wimsey? Yes.
Oh, good.
And I've got all of it sitting here. Well, wait a minute. My copy of Lord Peter is so tattered, it doesn't even have a cover anymore.
Oh, yay.
I have recently, during quarantine, decided to read everything that's on my shelves again. So I did go through all of the Peter Wimsey and all of her short stories again, just very, very recently. So, yes.
Do you tend to draw on her in your writings? Do you find yourself incorporating some of your favorite passages from Lewis or Tolkien or Sayers?
Well, Tim is often quoted as, he puts into his sermons a lot of everything sad is going to come untrue. In fact, we had a letter from Australia recently that I've got. It's my job to answer the correspondence, saying, where in the Bible is that? Everything sad is going to come untrue. So I'm going to have to do some hunting around for a verse that sounds appropriately about the new heavens and the new earth. Not strictly speaking in the Bible. Now I can't say that I've quoted a lot from Dorothy Sayers. I'm pretty much have confined myself to being a fiction reader rather than a nonfiction reader. And I say that as a confession, not a boast. I think it probably is past time, way past time, that I read some of her other things. I've read a number of her essays, but not recently, so that they don't spring immediately to mind whenever.
We ran across a excerpt online of Tim talking about how Dorothy had created Peter Wimsey, but he's struggling. He doesn't quite know where to go with his life, and she injects a character who's Harriet Vane, who he ends up marrying, and he interpreted it as that she was writing herself into the story as an alter ego of Harriet, and then he used that as an example of God writing himself into the story of human history. I thought that was a fascinating analogy.
You will remember, and I think Tim probably either consciously or unconsciously stole this from C.S. Lewis, from Jack, is that he talks about there's no way for Hamlet to get to know Shakespeare unless Shakespeare would write himself into the story. You can't. I think it was in God in the Dock, in the story, the essay about the cosmonaut that said that when he was up in space, he didn't see heaven, he didn't see God. And Lewis was responding to that saying, well, you wouldn't really expect to. It's not like Hamlet can go up into the eaves of his castle and look for Shakespeare. The only way he would know Shakespeare is if Shakespeare wrote himself in as a character into the play, that you're not going to take a spaceship up into the however far you go and find God unless God writes himself into human history, which he did.
Right. Lewis has a similar analogy that if you want to get to know an architect, you can only learn so much by looking at the windows and the balustrades and the dormer windows. But meeting the architect personally, you're going to get to know him in a way that you never could just by looking at his works. So I think that's a similar metaphor on Lewis's part.
That is relevant to an essay from which your husband quotes in several of his books by Dorothy Sayers. It's called Why Work? And she was very committed to the integrity of the work. And one of the things she said, and this might be a good way to bring our conversation to an end, is that the only Christian work is good work well done. So thank you for your good work and for sharing with us your connection with Lewis. Even I'm just so impressed that you had the chutzpah to just go out and write an author. That would have never occurred to me at age 12. And so that was good work well done.
I haven't even told you my greatest act of chutzpah was to tell Lewis I was going to visit him. My next door neighbors, the second to the last letter refers to this. I'll just tell you really quickly. My next door neighbor was English, and I was the babysitter to her child. And the grandparents back in England had never met the grandchildren. So I came along as the quasi-nanny. Of course, once the grandparents got their hands on the grandchildren, I didn't have a thing to do. But I was planning on going up to Oxford. They were going to take me up to see him. And that was 1963. And he died. And I didn't hear about it because he died the same day that Jack Kennedy died. So I didn't know anything about his death until they published a work by him in the Saturday Evening Post where they called him the late C.S. Lewis. And I ran around the house screaming, what? Late? What do you mean late? But when I got there to England for my birthday, which was in April, the people we were staying with drove us up to Oxford on that day as my birthday gift. And Warnie let us into the Kilns, let me into the Kilns, and let me pick flowers in the back garden, which I, of course, pressed inside my Narnia stories until they were raggedy. I've just got little crumbs of them left, but it was not restored. It was dark and dingy and, tobacco stained walls, etc. But the chutzpah of just knocking on the door and saying, hi, I'm an American fan. This was in 1964, so it was well before the flood of American fans, or otherwise I'm sure they would have set the dogs on me. But yes, that's what's being referred to as the holiday to which you are saving. There's none so good as the one that you're saving your money for.
Oh, he was talking about the one to England. You told me in a letter that you thought if the timing had been different, you could have given Joy Davidman a run for her money.
I don't know if I could have. I would have tried.
Well, and then, if I understand correctly, how appropriate that the ministry that you began with your husband, Tim Keller, was at Hunter. You met at Hunter College, which is where Davidman graduated from, right?
Yes, we met there for decades. And when they were trying to renovate their auditorium where we met, we said we'd be very happy to help them raise money because it would help us on Sunday. I mean, it's such disrepair. And they turned us down because of concerns of having an evangelical church do anything whatsoever with their city University of New York college. But I told them, look, you can raise money just on the strength of Helen Joy Davidman and who, and I had to refer to the movie with Deborah Winger and Anthony Hopkins before they had any idea what I was talking about, and they didn't know that she was an alum.
Wow. Wow.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And we will be praying for your husband's health.
Thank you.
And for peace for you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
In fact, we'll do that as soon as we get off this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So good talking to you, Kathy.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave a review on iTunes and especially tell your friends. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, and our resources, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.